We ended by looking at an example of a cheetah and thinking about how the selection forces would act on this cheetah. And the cheetah is trying to get food, compete with other organisms for food, and so the faster the cheetah can run, the better. Well, of course that has to do with muscle, but it also has to do with bone. The longer the leg, the further each pace will take the cheetah. So in theory, cheetahs would have longer and longer legs. So why don't we see cheetahs with long legs like a giraffe? Well, it turns out the longer the leg, the more fragile the bones actually are. And so there is kind of a point where natural selection has stopped on that particular trait. And so we start to see certain patterns in natural selection. And so that's where we're going next, is what natural selection patterns can be observed. Keep in mind that this is going to be happening over generations. And so what they've given us here is an original population and then an evolved population. So if you'll just put a little cloud around evolved, and keep in mind that means over generations. You could put over time. And so a quicker way to write generation, just don't think that it means minutes or hours. And so when we look at an original population here, this is actually showing a polygenic trait. It actually really depends on how many genes are involved and how many different phenotypes you have. You might just have 2 or 3 phenotypes. You might have even more. This trait, we're seeing a bell curve in the population, which signifies that it's polygenic, many genes contributing to one trait. So nice genetics review. And so what we see is that it is really important that they mentioned that natural selection happens on the phenotype. So whatever is selecting this population, whether it's a predator, whether it's the ability to get food, whether it's the ability to get a mate, whether it's the ability to live longer, whatever it is about this fur color, some selection forces can produce certain particular patterns. And so we see we've got the exact phenotypes against the frequency, and then over time we see that population has changed. The phenotypes have changed, which of course will mean that something in the genes have changed. And we're going to learn in the next section how to actually measure those changes in the alleles. But you do want to be able to think to yourself, well, if the phenotypes are changing, what does this mean about the genotype? So the first pattern that we see is directional. Next to directional, if you'll write one or the other. So this particular graph is showing directional selection in that there's being an advantage to having darker pigmentation of the fur, darker fur color. So our evolved population has shifted towards darker fur. There are fewer lighter furred individuals. And so, but it could have very well just as been the other way. Directional just means one direction, like the band. Disruptive selection is the idea of and. It's one extreme and the other extreme, but the average is at a disadvantage. So we can see in this graph here that it's no longer an advantage to be in the middle. So for some reason, the dark mice are surviving, the light mice are surviving, but these tan mice, their survival rate has decreased over time. And then finally, we have kind of the opposite of disruptive, which is stabilizing, which is where the average is at an advantage, and the two extremes are at a disadvantage. And so here the advantage is to be the average or the tan. And so what you need to be able to do is look at a data set and predict the population, and also be able to predict some other things about like what might happen to the alleles. The final pattern that we see is that some natural selection patterns happen based on relationships. And this is called coevolution. And co, the prefix, like codominant, means together. And so coevolution is actually where two separate species, so we're not talking about a cardinal and a cardinal. We're talking about two separate species have a relationship and both will impact each other. So we have to be really careful. It's not just a predator influencing a prey. That could happen, but that wouldn't be coevolution. Coevolution is where the predator impacts the prey and the prey impacts the predator. So a lot of things that we see here is like vision. Vision is a really good example of coevolution. So the idea that if a prey gets better, a predator is going around looking for something to eat, that means that the prey that are camouflaged will survive better. But the better the prey's camouflage get, the more pressure is on the prey, the predator, to actually be able to see that. So it has to be a two-way motion. It has to be that the predator puts pressure on the prey, and the prey puts pressure on the predator. So we do see it in predator-prey. We also see it in competition. Keep in mind, this is two species, so this is not competition for mates. This might be competition for food. This might be competition for space. This might be being able to outrun a natural disaster, would even be an example. We see symbiosis, and this is where we want to take a second and talk about a few really important examples. Keeping in mind it has to be two species and both impacting each other. So we're really not going to see very much commensalism. If you remember, commensalism is represented with +0. So one organism isn't being harmed, one organism is not benefiting. This one is kind of unaffected by the relationship. So we're probably not going to see much coevolution in commensalism, but we do see it with mutualism. One benefits, and that helps the other benefit. And so if one were to change, the other would benefit, or we'd have these selective pressures or forces. Parasitism is another really good example, but one of the most interesting examples is with pollinators. And so we're going to kind of take a little side trip here and talk about pollinators. Make sure that you understand, we want to make sure we understand what a pollinator is. A pollinator is an animal that is going to somehow be attracted to a plant, but actually to multiple plants. And as it travels, it helps spread the pollen, and the pollen is going to actually be the male gamete. Not sure if you knew this, but pollen is plant sperm. So when you have that pollen in the springtime, that is just the plant reproducing. And some plants are going to just release pollen into the air and hope it gets onto their species. Others have actually evolved to attract animals to help in this. As we spread the pollen, we are helping reproduce. So the pollinator actually decides which plants get to reproduce. So the pollinator is a selection force. And it turns out that animals are attracted to certain plants, and those plants will evolve more. So one of the really interesting examples is with the hummingbird. The hummingbird is one of the few animals that can see red. So the hummingbird is very attracted to the color red. It's going to visit those plants. And it just so happens that a lot of those red flowers were already narrow. A lot of them. Notice I didn't say all. We had some variation in the diameter of the flower, but because of the shape of the hummingbird's beak, it was selecting for flowers that were longer. The flower was actually also selecting for birds whose beaks were longer. So we see this back and forth, where the selection force of one has an impact on the other. And so we actually see a big relationship with pollinators and flowers, and that is mutualism. The animal actually usually gets fed. Not a lot, just a little, because it wants the plant has an advantage if the animal goes to lots. We want to get rid of saying the word want, and we want to realize that what that means is that there is an advantage. The flower doesn't want anything, but the flower has an advantage if it's doing certain things. So there are two videos that I'm going to ask you to pick one of and watch tonight. One is an evolutionary arms race video. Now, if you choose not to watch this video, I am going to ask you later to read the coevolution. But I've got two videos for you to watch today, so just pick one or the other. The evolutionary arms race, if you know anything about history, arms races are a really interesting phenomenon in our history as we develop more and more sophisticated weapons. And so this is a really interesting one to watch. The other video is down here, and it is on practical applications of evolution in society, and it's about tuberculosis. So you would Google, why does evolution matter now? And it's about a 6-minute video. So what we were ending with were some of the patterns, but how are these patterns actually observed? We're going to look at the fish together in class, and so I'm asking that you either look at antibiotic resistance or you look at this salamander newt and its toxin evolution. So pick one.